My name is Sarah Joy Pond from conveners.org. Our one sentence mission is to help get the right people in the right rooms, having the right conversations to change the world. And our team has had the privilege and pleasure of serving as the Secretariat for the Regenerative Crisis Response Committee, a truly remarkable group of economists, lawyers, historians, and thinkers, many of whom are former regulators themselves, who've come together with the mandate to identify, compare, and recommend changes in fiscal, monetary, and financial regulatory policies that are likely to enable the United States to achieve net carbon neutrality before 2050. One of the topics the committee has been engaging deeply around the past several months is exploring the scientific and economic limitations of voluntary carbon markets and carbon offsets in general as a strategy for accelerating the climate transition. And now we're pleased to share with you this conversation on the topic between committee members Sarah Bloom Raskin and Lawrence Baxter with guest expert Danny Cullenwald. We hope you enjoy it. So Danny, we'd like to start with a little introduction from you. Why don't offsets work? What about them doesn't work?
I'd like to point to typically two big picture issues that we have to deal with. One is scientific and one is more regulatory in nature. So the scientific challenge with offsets is that most of today's offset credits are crediting what's called avoided emissions. You're paying people to stop emitting, to avoid doing something bad, to avoid putting pollution in the atmosphere. That's maybe helpful as a first step as we think about managing the climate problem, but what we actually need when we do the deep decarbonization that we need to get on track for our climate plans is to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, to balance ongoing emissions and potentially even to start dealing with the historical buildup of those emissions in the atmosphere. But almost none of the projects or credits in today's industry actually perform that service. The regulatory side of this is maybe even more complicated. And it basically boils down to the fact that an offset project is making a claim against a counterfactual scenario that we can't see. And the offsets industry as it exists today is largely a self-governed industry where a lot of the players who are in charge of making extremely complicated decisions around how to run calculations and numbers have direct financial interests in the volume of credits being sold in these systems. So when you look very carefully at these systems, you see that there's enormous financial conflicts of interest that complicate an already technically very difficult problem that is ultimately something you can't actually observe. When you combine those conflicts of interest with the technical complexity, you end up with some pretty problematic outcomes.
One of the things that we have discovered as a committee as we've dug into this is that a lot of the really problematic dysfunction of process of offsetting comes at this intersection of the economics and the science.
Yeah, this issue, looking at carbon offsets, points to a real difference in the way scientists approach a problem and the financial sector approaches a problem. And we're going to have to do something about this because the financial sector has taken this idea of offsets and sort of run it in a way that is kind of commensurate with how financial regulation is done in this country. But the scientists are looking at this and are saying, whoa, wait a minute. This is not something that should be given, for example, to the private sector exclusively to be running because there are no standards. There's no defined terms. There's no quality control. And we've seen this. Lawrence and I have looked a lot at some of the things that happened in the financial crisis and understand where there are some vulnerabilities in terms of how financial regulation works in our country. So now taking an approach that is kind of the way the financial sector does it here, and to do it without a recognition of the science of it, which is, hey, this may not be doing anything to reduce emissions. This is going to do nothing to get us closer to our CO2 goals. That, I think, points to a real need to be bringing together in a closer way the financial regulatory community with the climate scientists. And I think we've got to speed up that effort. What do you think, Lawrence?
I agree entirely. I think it's particularly risky that this market, and I would prefer to call it a pseudo market, operates in an environment in which most financial market participants are trained to think that they work in a liquid market, that price discovery is something that they can, and in fact, in many financial markets, they can achieve, which I don't think applies here, in which the costs are generally internalized instead of externalized, which is not the case here, and in which intracommensurability is pretty well established. It can be tested through price discovery. So you've got conflicts of interest that are not actually exposed. You don't have disclosure. You don't have the intracommensurability. You don't really know what you're offsetting. And in the end, there's very real risk that it makes matters much worse rather than better. We're trained in market thinking and we're trained that markets are extremely effective, but that's not the case here.
You know, the other thing that I would observe is that this whole notion of offsets was really meant to be a mechanism for dealing with residual emissions, right? Those emissions that could not otherwise be remediated. And I think that we've lost sight of that in terms of the development of these carbon offset pseudo markets. They really should only be applicable to residual emissions. And yet I feel like that small opening has opened much wider and is now being used for almost anything.
It's almost as if they've become the modern financial equivalent of the medieval absolutions that you could buy from the Pope before you committed the sin.
It's so complicated when you dig into the history. Once you start thinking about stopping the climate problem and aiming for net zero, starting with offsets is completely backwards. And it's obvious from that point of view, but there's been so much effort to talk about scaling these markets and the volume of these markets, which almost necessarily implies substituting offsets for real reductions. And when you look at the role of offsets in government policies like cap and trade programs in California or Europe, offsets have directly substituted for reductions in those systems, replaced them with claimed reductions outside the systems, and therefore competed directly with the mitigation efforts that a sensible policy on offsets would be looking to support.
Which has not only acted as a disincentive to try to achieve a less emissive production, it may well be an incentive to achieve more because the price, rather like companies that pay fines for regulatory violations, the price is relatively low compared to the immediate profit benefits.
Right, and if we could make these credits perfect, that's an economic advantage. What we see in practice is that quality tends to get diluted. So you end up with a lower price. You also end up without the climate benefits that are being claimed in most of these systems. And offset credits tend to trade at much lower prices than those explicit prices you see in mandatory climate policy systems. So again, we are searching not for the things that represent the damage that we're causing. We're not setting the price point at the level of the externality. We're setting it much, much lower, which again is causing the market to search for things that really don't solve the problem that's in front of us.
So what are the potential interventions that will reform that link between the actual cost of what's being done and the solutions that are directly impacting it?
So there's got to be a much greater transparency and awareness around the differences in the kinds of credits that are claimed so that people can track and put pressure to do the things that are needed in the long run. Right now, you're seeing a lot of very low quality claims being made. And so people say it's cheaper to offset than it is to reduce their own pollution. We need to get really clear about that.
Yeah, what you're talking about, those are huge regulatory shapings that need to happen here. And, I'm thinking about how financial regulation is done in our country, and it is done, primarily after the fact. Like we kind of wait and we intervene after the disaster has occurred. And of course, the climate emergency doesn't present itself the way other risks have presented themselves. And this idea of waiting isn't going to work. So certainly the disclosure piece that you talk about, the conflict of interest piece that you talk about is going to need to get really handled now. It has to get handled now, and it has to be done in real time. It strikes me that it's of a quite urgent nature, and it has to be done quickly. And I, query as to, the political economy of that, how that can happen. But my sense from what you're prescribing here is that we have to start on this now.
Well, I think the other thing to say on this is it's not like we haven't seen this before. So in the financial crisis, one of the great problems with securities issues was that you had ratings agencies that were being paid by the people who wanted to issue securities. We have a very similar market structure right now in the offsets industry, by no means as large as mortgage-backed securities, but the financial relationships between the players is almost directly analogous to those well-documented issues that I think the financial regulatory community has already acknowledged.
And on that specific feature of the financial crisis, namely the ratings agencies being paid by the issuers to conduct these ratings, this was fixed after the fact. It didn't get fixed before. It required a statutory, congressional act. And even then, I don't even know if it's been done yet. This might even be one of the things that hasn't even been fixed yet after Dodd-Frank. So, it's good to be identifying these features now. I just have to say that in experience of financial regulation in the US, I have yet to see these kinds of issues addressed early.
Not only has it not been fixed because of a lot of lobbying pressure, but it's also very difficult to fix to this extent. With the credit rating agencies, one of the suggestions was an alternative, which would be a government rating agency. And it was dismissed not only because there's a reaction against government doing this, but because of the capacity of government to actually do it. The reality is it's a huge, huge task. And we have to develop better public-private partnerships here that we need, for example, the scientific studies and the organizations that can objectively assemble this. The industry can't do it. It's a tragedy of the commons. They've got immediate profit motives. There's very little incentive on them unless they are under mandates.
But it begins with the recognition that the claim that all offset credits are perfect and co-equal is a farce.
Indeed.
But that is also the claim that the industry essentially makes as a universal statement about the product it puts out. We're not at a point where the industry is able to acknowledge and begin a critical dialogue around those issues. And to me, that's the barrier into moving to the conversation that you've articulated, Lawrence.
Well, then that gets back to Sarah's point about how we've traditionally approached this as a reactive basis. It's taken a crisis to get any change at the regulatory level. This is very new territory. It's got to be proactive, and it's not something I think even our regulators are very comfortable addressing. This is about as profoundly systemic a problem as we've ever seen.
And I'll mention just as an aside, I think one of the reasons this is so complicated is it takes the mindset of a financial regulator to think about the transactions and the industrial structures. The technical issues are much more around either complex climate science questions, or if it's about, say, forest offsets, ecology. And frankly, we're learning more and more that land management issues and qualitative social science constructs are incredibly important to evaluating the quality claims in these programs. These are really disparate areas where there are traditions of knowledge and successful interventions, but they've rarely been combined, and you have to combine them to succeed in terms of getting ahead of the problem on offsets.
Also profoundly interdisciplinary, and we're not very good at talking across disciplines with each other.
The way scientists understand the carbon cycle, it's so much more complicated. And over in policy and finance land, people want numbers to put into spreadsheet cells. And the scientists say, oh, this is really dumb. The flip side is you need something that's that simple to be tractable.
Right.
Construct. You very quickly get to the point where only a relatively small number of Earth scientists are fluent in those concepts, yet they are essential to setting what a quality control standard should be, what prudence and diligence should be in a financial transaction, and how to sequence either a series of regulatory disclosures or potentially in the future mandatory standards where you expect everybody to meet a certain minimum amount. You've got to understand all of that.
One area where we're not very good in public policy is the line of talk. And you sort of talked about how you have to dumb down the science to actually communicate something impactfully to the general public. I don't know that we're very good at explaining to your average person in the street why climate change is actually going to engulf them as well. It seems to me government has to get better at doing that.
So if we take the example that we've been working on here, using the 2008 financial crisis as a place to start from and to reflect on, what are the bright spots that we can take from that and say, this might work in terms of, do we need to create a new agency? Do we need to have a bunch of hearings? Do we, what about the way that was handled might we take and apply to this situation? And what about the way that we handled that might we do differently?
I like the question quite a bit, Sarah Joy. I want to be cautious, though, in not equating the financial crisis with what we are in the midst of now in terms of climate and, the scientific consensus that it's only going to really get worse. Well, we've had two crises, right? You could also say that the pandemic itself was an economic shock that tested financial regulators. The crises themselves, I think, are of a different nature. And I would caveat everything with that, with that statement. At the same time, so I think we do have quite a bit to draw upon. To me, I have been focused on the timing element. I mean, if there were a way to actually bring a precautionary principle into our regulatory work, I think that would really help. I think the costs are exceedingly excessive when you wait. And by the way, when you're talking about an existential crisis like climate, I don't even know what waiting means, but we are already, I think, having to spend more money. Our economy is suffering more from the fact that we are waiting before taking all tools and bringing them to bear on the crisis. I also think that the financial regulators need to be a little bit more bold than they have been to date. I think that they have tools there that they may not even be aware of that they have, and they need to be encouraged to think about those tools as tools that could really come to bear in some meaningful way. I would argue they don't always, some of these tools can be used without new legislation. They are available right now, but they need to be adapted for this particular set of risks. And I'd like to see them do that, use a little bit more imagination and boldness and not wait, because this is not that kind of situation where waiting is going to be the best approach.
I'll just flag that, one of the things that came out of the financial crisis was the creation of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And one of the things that did, I have family who work in consumer protection, is, created institutional capacity and career paths for people who wanted to specialize in that. I'm excited to see the SEC and the Fed and other financial regulators step up and start to engage these issues, but they're in a capacity building mode when it comes to the climate expertise. And I think that that's a critical area where the financial regulators probably have a lot more to learn and to build, along with the existing strengths they've already got.
So one of the things that the committee has talked a lot about is the possibility of moving to a contribution model instead of an offset model, particularly the mandates that come along with that. Talk to me about why that's compelling and what difference does it make on the corporations that would be adopting it, and then also on the regulatory side.
If it's a common set of mandates, I think it makes it a lot easier for the corporations because, for those competitive reasons, they're not subject to the uncertainty of what their competitors would do. They all know they have to meet a certain goal. And I think we're seeing that emerging with electric vehicles. Cities like Paris and Athens saying that combustion engines will not be allowed in there after 2030. It changes the industrial design. Assuming that the mandates are rational and scientifically based, and you worry about all the lobbying getting in the way and you end up with irrational mandates. But this gets back to what Danny was saying about how tricky it is to get the connection between the scientists and the public policy makers. The financial industry, especially the banks, are used to fairly tough regulation. They complain about it and they dodge it and so on. But Dodd-Frank, for example, brought in or solidified mandates that the Fed was already developing, for example, on capital levels and liquidity. And those were mandates. The banks had to adjust to them in ways that other industries chafe against. When the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's extended regulation to non-banks, they really hated it because it was new to them. Now, they don't want to stop lending to fossil fuel companies, but there are ways to sort of make them reduce it based on the risk that climate change is posing for both those financial companies and their the assets in which they're invested and so on. So it's always seemed to me that the financial regulatory system, while it would have to be much bolder than it is now, is almost uniquely adapted to take the kind of command and control action that we have to use to supplement market-based actions. Quickly the efficiency of the market breaks down in these kinds of situations, and that's where the whole point of government mandates comes in. Don't you think, Sarah? Am I being too Pollyanna-ish?
No, I think that that's a strong rationale. One thing that mandates do is across the board, they create a playing field where every institution within that sector is going to need to play by the same rules. And that's not only good from the perspective of eliminating and mitigating emissions, but it's also good from the perspective of there's no argument that can be made that, that this regulation is favoring one player over another. So yeah, I think it makes quite a bit of sense.
The other thing to point out is there's this sort of enormous fiction around the ability of, extremely cheap offsets to get you out of any problem you might face, say on the corporate side. And so long as people believe that that's a possibility, they won't engage in the strategic behavior we need to figure out what they can do and to respond to the strategic incentives of potential or actual future mandates to actually push them along. If you're an executive in a random sector that's not directly tied to the energy industry, you're making up your mind right now about whether or not you think these options are credible and cheap alternatives to the direct investment and performance changes your business might otherwise need to see in the years ahead. And so long as the sense that this is a path out persists, I think it's going to cause a lot of C-suite, type executives to prioritize things differently than if they took a cold hard look at what offsets deliver right now.
Yeah, this is really relevant to how we prioritize the regulatory work that needs to get done. So can you scale for us how significant right now carbon offsets are? Sort of where they are in terms of their evolution. Are these mature markets?
Decades. So it's funny. I tell you that because in Europe, people have been talking about this issue for 15 years. And in the US, it's kind of new. The industry is somewhat old. If you look at it, many of the core organizations have track records of 10 years or more. But everybody feels like they're on the precipice of a renaissance because all of the talk around net zero climate has opened up this possibility of them scaling their markets 10 or 100-fold. I had a debate with an important person in the clean energy and climate finance world who said to me, he said, look, this offset stuff, it's all a problem to me, but it's just not that big of a deal because it's a couple of $100 million a year. And in my world, in the finance world, that's a small global deal flow. Even if that goes to a couple of billion a year, it's a drop in the bucket compared to project finance in the utility sector. He's absolutely right. But I think the flip side of this, and I think the more pernicious effect is what I alluded to. It is the perception that non-experts, that executives, that financial leaders have, that there will be something that comes forward in the future that absolves them of the need to take significant action now and in the near term. And that mistaken perception, I think, is of the absolute most critical importance.
Right. And this, Lawrence, goes to your point about communication and how this gets articulated, because the carbon offset market, as it gets more mature and ingrained in the minds of American companies and entities, you can imagine that, if we don't get this communication right, that there will be, in essence, an establishment of a mindset that you can offset your way to net zero. And we're learning that that's not the case. And yet, if we don't kind of shift the conversation, we could be going down the wrong path.
I've heard that firsthand from somebody, a CEO on Wall Street, who actually said, you are looking at a whole lot of solutions that will go nowhere and lead to corruption, blah, blah, blah. He said, offset markets will solve this problem. Now, he wasn't being arrogant. He was literally uninformed. But it was a very comfortable belief because it did, as Danny said, it absolves them in advance of real hard decision making. But as we know, this is a very simplistic view. I don't think his motives are bad. I think he really believes it.
No, I think there's a community of good faith proponents, particularly in the financial sector, that look at the offsets industry today. They see illiquid markets, they see bespoke, complex, expensive transactional structures. They see all of these problems that to them look like early stage disorganized markets in need of financial maturity and the interventions that sophisticated financiers specialize in. And the fundamental problem with that point of view is we have so many different ways of trying to create climate benefits, almost none of which are comparable to one another. All of them in the offsets markets produce a credit that says I'm worth 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. But what's actually going on and what you need to manage for is so fundamentally different. I don't think we're ever going to see a commodity-like market emerge. But I see a lot of what I would call good faith financier proponents saying, how do I turn this into a mature liquid commodity market? And I don't think it ever will be.
I think that's my biggest concern about Mark Carney's organization. He's very honorably intending to clean up the market, but then creating this problem of perception, which is, that's all we sort of need to do.
Their theory of change, they'll be able to set a designation of what counts as a good offset. But I think on many of the most important dimensions of offset quality, there may be no offsets that actually meet a reasonable standard of quality.
Yeah.
And that's what worries me about that sort of private standard setting process is with all of the incumbents in the room there, very few of them are going to want to say, none of us actually meets the standard. And if they bend the rules a little bit, that means all of the new entrants who are trying to do a responsible job are competing on price against people who are bending the rules, selling the same thing, a ton of climate benefits. And now a buyer who isn't incredibly sophisticated will have to ask, do I like the startup with the brand new idea that a bunch of scientists say might be a good approach? Or do I like the credit being transacted in a blue ribbon certified structure with a lot of famous and important people backing it? It presents a very difficult problem for the buyers who are not themselves extraordinarily technically complicated or technically sophisticated.
And even the regulators are going to be more comfortable with the blue ribbon option because that's also what they know. It's going to take a lot of adaptation by the regulators as well.
To return to the origins of what the carbon offset market is intended to do, which is to reduce residual emissions. Is there a possibility that these markets or programs could be structured in such a way that you wouldn't qualify for them unless you proved that you had a residual emission that you could not otherwise deal with? Is there a threshold that you can imagine being kind of the gateway into the use of an offset so that we would keep the floodgates from opening and letting in everything? Because it seems to me that the residual emission piece could be defined quite specifically, and so that you then wouldn't be able to qualify for the use of an offset unless you met that particular definition.
I think the concept is a clear and valuable concept. And the problem is what is residual is going to depend heavily on what sector you're in and increasingly on the political economy of individual firms. So very different concepts around the life cycle emissions of different product pathways that are potentially very challenging to manage because you could see people making reasonable differences of opinion around what residual is. Big picture, the idea that you want to sequence this and gatekeep the sort of permission to do this toward the residual emissions, couldn't agree more, but there's a lot of complexity to work out to define what that means. And there'll be a lot of politics around that too.
The old an impending execution tends to focus the mind.
I think, the idea that if there is a credible threat of a serious regulatory effort, that will focus the mind, that makes a lot of sense to me. But any creative thinking we do around like sequencing or standards, we don't even have basic disclosure requirements in place. It's extraordinarily difficult to say what people are doing right now, let alone what they ought to be doing.
I think my last question would be, what gives you the most hope regarding this challenge and the potential paths forward?
I think one of the bright spots is you are seeing the golden era of business and climate journalism right now, and a lot of it is focused on these exact issues. The other thing is that I think more and more scientists are interested in these questions, and there's room to dialogue and to bring in capacity from those sectors to talk about what's working and what isn't.
I guess I would say I'm quite heartened by the momentum. I mean, I think we are seeing a focus on climate in a way that this country hasn't focused on it before. Now, of course, we can criticize the evolution of carbon offset markets and whether they are evolving in the direction that they need to be. But the point is I think you've got a real momentum and collective effort around that. And then the second point of optimism is we do have to bring communities of thought together here. This cannot be run by the financiers alone. We do need to bring the scientists into it. And by the way, the scientists, they can't put their heads under the rocks. We need them, and we need them to engage in dialogues that they might not be that inclined to engage in, but we need them. And I think this kind of synergy between the two, I think, is something that we should try to focus on.
I do have a lot more faith in innovation than most people. I don't think innovation will solve the problems in themselves, but that old adage, necessity is the mother of invention, that mandates themselves are likely to generate or force innovation. And I do have an endless faith in our ability as humans to innovate beyond our wildest expectations.
Thanks again for joining us, and please reach out with any follow-up questions.